Hello and welcome to the Arc Woman podcast. This is an exploration of womankind. Here we discuss what it is to be a woman in the modern world while utilizing ancient and modern modalities in tandem to create a bounty of health for the body, mind and spirit.
G'day everyone and welcome back to the pod. Today I'm joined by the incredible Dr. Melanie Jackson. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I am recording today's episode in Lutruwita, Tasmania. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and honour their continuing custodianship of the lands, rivers and seas. Always has, always will be, baby. Dr. Melanie Jackson, also known as Melanie the Midwife, is an Australian home birth midwife, researcher and podcast host. In fact, she is actually a 2026 Australian of the Year nominee, so make sure you vote for her. Her thesis on birth outside of the system, wanting the best and safest, has contributed important insights for women's experiences of birthing beyond conventional models of care. She has published academic journals, worked in multiple research roles, and she has lectured at Western Sydney University. Mel, we are glad to have you, so let's get into it. Well, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time out of your super busy schedule. I really appreciate your time. Can you please explain who you are and tell us your story and what gravitated you towards midwifery and then eventually towards your PhD thesis focusing on birthing outside of the system?
Yeah. Okay. Well, my name's Dr. Melanie Jackson. I operate, if you've seen me online or anything, it's Melanie the Midwife. And a lot of my work centers at the moment around the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. And I actually started my career as a care provider as a naturopath. So that was my first qualification. Yeah, straight from school. I went into university and I did a 3-year degree in health science and naturopathy. And for about 3 or 4 years, I worked as a naturopath, herbal medicines and nutrition and homeopathy and all the things. And as I was seeing clients, I was noticing that it was predominantly women who were coming. A lot of them had children. And I was noticing just a lot of their health conditions were related to malnutrition and potentially stemmed back to their pregnancies and births. So it kind of inspired me to start looking further into just gaining knowledge for myself on how I can help these women. And I thought I really need to understand pregnancy and birth and the postpartum journey more thoroughly. And, I was in my young 20s. I hadn't had children before. I wasn't really in that world. And as I started looking for information, I came across this profession of midwifery. And I thought, oh, maybe that could be a good degree to do in order to get the information or the education that I'm looking for that I can apply to my work as a naturopath. That was the intention, is to be specifically in that field as a naturopath, not as a midwife. But pretty quickly, I was definitely hijacked by the allure of midwifery. And so the quickest way for me to become a midwife and then also progress, I guess, in my academic career, not that that was my intention, but I thought if we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So I did a master's in nursing and then I did a postgraduate degree in midwifery. And during my nursing, I was so committed to midwifery that actually every opportunity I had to even, choose an assignment or choose a topic, it was always about birth or postpartum or pregnancy. So I felt like I'd done 3 years of midwifery by the end anyway. And for a while, I was doing both naturopathy and midwifery because I was working as a private midwife where women would hire me to come to them and do all of their care, and they were having home births, and then I would do all their postnatal care. And pretty quickly, my passion for midwifery outgrew the naturopathy work. And now I still use what I know about natural medicine and nutrition and health as I care for my clients, but it's not my predominant work. So I just became sort of obsessed with midwifery. And I think that was obvious because a few times I was kind of headhunted for higher degrees in midwifery. And that's what happened after I finished my degree, is the university approached me and said, hey, we'd be interested in you joining a PhD program to continue your studies. And at the time I was like, no, only smart people do PhDs. I definitely would not be in that category. And I remember the woman sitting down, my lecturer, she was like, Mel, have you seen some of the idiots that are in our PhD program? She said, you'll be fine. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, let's give it a go. And so my supervisor, who's now my very dear friend and mentor, Professor Hannah Darlin, she said, all right, choose a topic that you are absolutely passionate about. And I just thought of birth outside the system was it was an interest area for me. And then, of course, I went on, entered the PhD program, and I finished my PhD when I was 28, the same year that I had my son, my first baby. And since then, I've been working as a private midwife, so still working clinically, but have definitely stepped into the realm of sort of asking myself, how can I have maximum impact on the world with the limited time that I have? And that's really what's inspired my work through the Great Birth Rebellion podcast, as well as just reaching as many people as possible.
Incredible. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And I had no idea you started with naturopathy. And I really understand now how that is absolutely traced through that line and that lineage of midwifery, and like just that real honoring of that sovereignty of that woman. What do you want? What feels safe to you? Whether that is a C-section, whether that is being induced, whether that is staying home and birthing in a pool, basically. And just at the outset, so we understand, what is physiological birth? Because birth is an umbrella term, and so many different things can fall under it. And physiological birth, I guess, is one half of that, maybe like a third. Do you mind explaining what that is to our audience?
Yeah. So physiology is basically a word that describes this is how your body works. So there's a physiological, your body works in a way to poo and wee and orgasm and bleed and, digest. These are all physiological functions of our body. This is how our body works. And one of the physiological functions of a woman's body is conceive, grow babies, and give birth to them. So it's a physiological process. We don't have to force it. If everything is well, we don't force these things. We don't have to mentally invest in them. If you become pregnant, even if you think nothing of that pregnancy, the baby will grow, and if your body's working well, if it's functioning at an optimal physiological pace or way, then your body will grow a baby, birth a baby, and feed a baby. That's our physiological function. So when we talk about physiological birth, it's just a birth that is functioning in the way that our bodies were designed. And that would be in the same as, having a menstrual bleed, any other function that our body performs. Our heart beats. Of course, all of the physiological functions of our body can meet pathology, and they can become pathological. So if your menstrual cycle has a state of pathology, maybe it's endometriosis, maybe it's hormonal imbalance, we meet these potential pathologies within our own physiology, where our physiology is no longer functioning and it's become more of a pathological state. It's the same for birth and pregnancy as a physiological process. Is at some point in that physiological process, something might not function properly. And there's specific health professionals whose job it is to sort of supervise these life events and these physiological processes to work out, is this the time where things are still good and functioning normally? We don't have to do anything. We can continue to just trust that the body knows what it's doing. And then there's times where that health professional might say, okay, actually, this is abnormal. We're transitioning into a potentially pathological state. So midwives are tasked with the, nurturing and nourishing of the physiological process of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. And then in the event that it becomes a pathological moment in that physiological process, then there's other specialist health professionals that we can bring in to help, like an obstetrician or an endocrinologist or a hematologist or, a sonographer, other testing and monitoring and care in the event that things are not going well. So physiological birth is just how our bodies work to have a baby. There's a hormonal physiological process. There's a kind of a step-by-step expectation of how our bodies work to have babies. And obviously that explaining that to people is, a whole episode. If I was going to explain how the physiology of birth, there's millions of papers written about that, but that's fundamentally what physiological birth is just, if you left it alone and there was nothing wrong, this is what would happen.
And what you're explaining, midwives, the partnership of that birth and the monitoring of the progression of that pregnancy and knowing when to intervene. And I guess the word intervention, whenever I hear the word intervention, I immediately think of like more modern medicine, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be your raspberry leaf tea and your menstrual dates. It could also be curb walking. It could also be maybe you need to be induced. Maybe we need to think about C-section. And I guess a midwife is in partnership with that woman, is monitoring that pregnancy and knows when to step in and can help that woman decide on the risks versus the benefits of, say, birthing at home, free birthing, going to a hospital, etc. Before we go on and talk a little bit more about like more natural physiological birth, I just want to ask you, what is the difference between a home birth and a free birth? We were talking about this before, and I was just like, this is so fundamental. I need to add this in. Can you explain the difference between those? Because they're not the same.
No. So, you know, and when we're talking about free birth and home birth, we're talking about birth locations here, but also birth preparation. So for anybody who's not had a baby, if you're listening and thinking, oh my gosh, firstly, I understand home birth, but what is free birth? There are kind of, if I think about 5 options for where and how you might have your baby. The first would be a free birth, which we'll talk about. Then a home birth. There's the option of a birth center, public hospital, or private hospital. So you kind of can choose between one of those things. A home birth is the accepted terminology of home birth is that you plan to have your baby at home under the care of a trained health professional, which is usually a midwife. Midwives are the experts in normal physiological birth. We know what normal looks like, and then we know what it looks like for things to be abnormal. And so having a home birth means you plan to have a midwife with you. A free birth, although it is giving birth at home, it's the intentional plan to not invite a health professional into your birth space. So the woman becomes her own care provider, and it becomes her responsibility to recognize when things are normal, recognize when things might not be normal, and make decisions about if they're going to stay at home or seek additional help. And so a free birth is a conscious and active choice not to engage with the maternity care system and to give birth outside of the system, which was the topic of my PhD. And this is different to somebody who didn't choose that. So it's not like women in low or middle income countries who don't have access to healthcare are choosing to have a free birth. That's different. Free birth is positioned more as a privileged choice of having options, but choosing not to engage with those options, choosing to refuse the general medical maternity care system, and they sort of sit outside of that. That's a very crude definition. So the two are very different because of the presence of the healthcare provider or not. And we have heaps of research. The research on home birth has been overdone, in my opinion. I think we can all agree that the findings are fairly conclusive. There's lots of very big studies about the outcomes of home birth. And we can all agree that for low risk women who choose to give birth at home, they're in no more danger, taking no more additional risk than a woman who would decide to give birth in hospital. The outcomes are very equivalent for babies. They're much, much better for the women. So depending on who you're focusing on, if you're planning on having a home birth. The theory that some women who free birth have is that when you take out the maternity care provider, you can make the birth safer because a lot of them see a midwife or a care provider as potentially an interruption to the physiological process of birth. And then that could invite problems into the birth physiology. And I will just say that's theoretical. We don't have any research or any data collection methods ever. There's been no study published on the outcomes of free birth. As far as we know, free birth could be far safer than any other birth option, but we have no idea about that because there's no research that looks at the outcomes of free birth. So anybody saying free birth is safer, things are less likely to go wrong, you know, when you take out a care provider, you take out certain risks of birth, that's theoretical. That's a theory. There's no research to prove any of that. So the dialogue is tricky because a lot of it is based on emotion, opinion, and theory. We haven't been able to prove either way if free birth is more or less dangerous than other options.
And we were talking about this before as well. the women least likely to be involved in any type of study, any even type of like post-birth prospective study where it's just interviews and it's qualitative and quantitative. They are the least likely to want to be involved in this. So if you're listening to this and you've done a free birth, maybe we could all get together and create the first study on those outcomes and get studies on those.
Yeah, it's really tricky because free birth has been ostracized. The women who choose these things have been called names and bullied in the media, and there's all these assumptions made. And that was certainly something that I looked at in my PhD, is like, why would they choose this? But also the social drama around free birth and how women who make these choices are often pictured as or painted as being, stupid. And so I think it's fair that they're very reluctant to engage in that conversation through fear of their words being used against them. So historically, society has been mean to these women, and they're not interested in engaging. I mean, they weren't particularly interested in engaging with the system as it was. And I know, I've been approached by lots of news outlets to talk about free birth. And a lot of the women who have had free births get really angry, like, you shouldn't be speaking for us. But then on the other side, they're like, well, we're not going to talk to the media. I'm like, well, someone's got to. You can't, if you want to get you've got to engage. But I can understand the apprehension. And then in terms of collecting data, it's very hard to get women to come forward and declare and admit that something went wrong with their free birth or that there was a poor outcome. So even if I've thought about the logistics of this because I'm super curious. I'm like, wouldn't it be cool if we could actually do a study on the outcomes and enroll women and then they submit their outcomes later? I would imagine that there would be a reluctance from women whose birth didn't go the way they expected to actually submit that data. And, I think there's logistical issues, but yes, it would be good if we could get an answer. But at the moment, it's theoretical. In theory, whatever people are saying about free birth, it's not founded. Even to say it's dangerous, we have no idea.
Okay,
if that is
thank
the
you.
case. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that clarity, because in the Free Birth Society, I don't want to say the Free Birth Society because that is a podcast and they're wonderful women. But I guess the free birth community, there's a lot of apprehension and there's almost a lot of self-belief that it is faultless in a way, and then like nothing can go wrong and be hush-hush if something does because you could negatively impact the movement. And I understand that. I absolutely understand that when you see the allopathic modern medicine model as your enemy, and they are historically not worked with you and in fact have worked to work against you. And I can understand an integration with that model is unlikely. But I guess what I want women to understand, if they are thinking about free birthing, if they have free birth, if they've had positive or negative outcomes, that the more information we know about free birth, the better outcomes that we can give you. We can give you better information on how we can safely do that, better information on how you know the warning signs, and so you can move forward and know when intervention is needed, and so we can decrease deaths and decrease like any type of intervention or negative outcome that you might experience. But moving on from that, when I think of home birth, when I think of free birth, I think this is very often what people think of. They think of water. I think that's just what we always think of. That's the thing that goes viral online. It's just this woman very peacefully, silently giving birth in water. And I wanted to touch on water birth. You have a whole podcast episode on water birth I found very interesting. Could you please tell us what are some common myths about water birth, including concerns of starving the baby of oxygen? That's a very popular one at the moment. Can you speak on that?
Yes, I would love to. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a home birth midwife. And so at home, we don't have any pharmaceutical pain relief. There's no gas, there's no injections, morphine, pethidine, definitely no epidurals. So women who commit to having home births are committing to having their baby without any pharmaceutical pain relief. And so when we're planning the birth, we're planning, okay, well, how we need a toolkit, some strategies to work through this labor without any pain medication. That there's not even an option at home. If you want it, you have to go to hospital. And women know that. So they make as many plans as they possibly can, so as many sort of management strategies they put in place to help them work through labor without pain medication. And the pain of labor is a physiological pain. As we were talking about physiological birth, there's a physiological pain that accompanies labor. And what we know is when you take the pain away, you interrupt the hormonal process of labor and birth, and it doesn't function as well. So without pain, which is like a feedback mechanism, when you get the pain of contraction, it sends messages to your brain to say, right, we need endorphins, we need more oxytocin. It keeps the active hormonal flow of labor going. And so women who give birth at home, they acknowledge that this is purposeful pain. The pain of labor and birth is purposeful. There's a reason that it's there, and we can use it and work with it to keep our physiology going so that hopefully the birth is uncomplicated. So the fewer times you interrupt the physiological process, the more likely it is to keep flowing and functioning as it should. And taking away the pain of labor is a massive piece out of the physiological puzzle. When you take pain out, you also interrupt physiology. You've made birth medical. When you choose to try and reduce or remove the pain, birth becomes pathological and it has to be managed medically. So at home, because we haven't done that, you've got to come up with a list of options of, okay, how am I going to navigate this physiological pain that I have to work through if I want my body to function physiologically? And when we're at home, that's what we want. We want to reduce the amount of possibilities of things going wrong because we're at home. And so the focus is on supporting physiology, making sure the body is functioning optimally so that everything theoretically continues to be normal. Water birth is like, I call it the home birth epidural. It's the thing you use when you've exhausted the rest of your pain management toolkit. And actually, you can feel free to take this out if you want to, but I've been watching women give birth for 18 years at home and helping them work through that. And I did it myself. And I've put together this very short and quick and helpful guide to giving birth without pain relief. And it lists all these other things you can have in your toolkit before you get to water birth and before you even use the water. But I always say to women, I think it's a good idea if you're giving birth at home, be prepared to use water. And then if you don't need it, you don't need it. So I'd say 70% of my clients give birth in water. So water, if you consider it, some people say water birth is an intervention, just like gas would be or medication would be or an epidural. They said that's an intervention, whereas the research would suggest it's actually more like a low birth location. So did you give birth on the bed? Did you give birth in the shower? Did you give birth on your knees, on the couch, or in the pool? It's not. And when you look at the research on water birth, if it was an intervention, you would see an intervention is more like a solution to a problem. So, hey, we've got a problem. We need to do something to change this. Whereas water birth is just a location. It's like changing positions. And when you look at the research on water birth, actually, and if you've heard the podcast episode, the outcomes in water are better. And it's not specifically that the water has some kind of magical properties, but it allows for things like if you're in the water, nobody has access to you. So some complications that could happen as a result of your care provider or your location, you're actually protected from in this beautiful, watery barrier. No one can give you an episiotomy. They're not going to tell you that it's time to get on your back and push your baby out. There's a whole lot of things that you can avoid just by being in water. But also there's it's quite relaxing when women sink into the water. They have this, there's this like audible sigh of like, oh my gosh, like this is good. And when you can relax and settle into labor like that, of course your physiology is going to function better, your fear reduces. We know that you can reduce the severity of tears when you're giving birth in water. There's a whole range of benefits. The outcomes for the babies are not worse. So when people say, oh, a baby born in water would deoxygenate, or they have all these other extra risks. There are 2 extra risks of water birth that are higher if you give birth in water compared to land, but they're very minor and there's great solutions. And this is why I love research, because I'm like, we can find out the shortfalls of something and then we can fix it so easily. So one thing about giving birth in water, the cord can accidentally snap more often in water than on land. And that's just owing to poorer visibility, that when the baby comes out, the mum is usually the one to pick the baby up. And if there's a shorter cord that they weren't anticipating, the cord snaps. So then we go, okay, there's an increased risk of that in water. So let's be vigilant around the cord. So for me, as well as a midwife, I go, right, the baby's out, the woman's picking the baby up. I'm paying attention to the cord. Is it looped around the baby? Do we need to unravel it before bringing the baby up? Is it a short cord? And then once the baby's up, I'm just having a little quick look at its belly button to make sure that the cord hasn't snapped. And I'm like, great, I know that that could be a risk, but here I am using that knowledge to improve the outcomes from that, and educating the woman too, beforehand, we're going to bring the baby up. Carefully be aware that we don't want to risk snapping that cord. The other risk is a slight increase in maternal uterine infections if you give birth in water. However, the research on that shows that it doesn't increase the need for hospitalization. So it appears as though, although there's a slight increase, they're not severe and they're manageable under midwifery care when compared to giving birth on land. So those are the two things we're just aware of. And if the woman does have symptoms of infection, we sort of go, okay, we know this is a possibility in water birth, just as it is on land, and we manage it accordingly. So the claims that water birth is dangerous are definitely unfounded if you look at the research papers. And if you've got a skilled care provider who knows that if the baby's distressed, obviously you don't give birth in water, that baby needs to be born on land. And if there's signs of already a potential infection or meconium stained liquor, we don't give birth in the water. And then you improve outcomes for the women and the babies. Yeah.
Okay, going on from that. Okay, water birth sounds incredibly protective and comfortable for mum. Amazing birth outcomes, all around pretty great. No risks for baby, not going to drown, not going to have any low oxygen. Why don't hospitals allow women to give birth in water? Because I live in Hobart. And the Hobart Royal here, I had women over at my house recently. 2 of them were pregnant. I said, you're going to give birth at the Royal? Yes. Oh, are there birthing pools there? Wonderful. Okay, I know the risk of birth outcomes, decreases significantly with water. That's wonderful. Oh, but we're not allowed to give birth in the pool. So what's with that? Why are women allowed in water if they do have those facilities, but why are they not allowed to actually give birth and have the baby come out of them physiologically in water? Is there any reason for that?
No. Red tape, that's the reason. So when you go into hospital, and there's been a stack of research about this too, sociological research about birth will tell you that when you walk into a hospital, the people who work there believe that they own that territory. They are now the bosses. This is our house. You've come into our house. We own this house. We set the rules. And that is a basic overview of hospital birth, not just around water birth, around a whole lot of other things. There are a whole list of rules around the things that you are allowed to do in their facility and things that you aren't allowed to do in their facility. The problem with that is, and this is why we say that the maternity care system is a little bit cooked, if you ask me, because women are autonomous decision makers. We're not in a state of illness. Usually when we arrive at the hospital, sometimes we are, and we can make choices around that. But in those scenarios, in the scenario of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, we're the autonomous decision makers. We can actually walk in and use that facility as our own home. And that's something that I recommend to women is when you walk into that hospital, assume that you own the space and that it is not their territory, because actually the policies and the law and social ruling would dictate that we are autonomous women. We make the decisions about what position we want to be in, where we want to stand, if we want to be in water or out of water, if we'll accept an intervention or not. We theoretically have the power. However, the way that the hospital system is crafted is designed to make us think that we don't have power in that facility. So there's rules, a lot of rules in a hospital facility because there's insurance. It's a system, which means everybody has to play their part, and it's set up in a particular way, a little bit like a factory line. We do this, then we do this, then we do this, and here are the rules of our facility. So giving birth in water is, they feel as though the clinicians need a little bit of extra training. So there's usually a training module involved in a hospital where they will train the clinicians to be water birth endorsed or qualified. So firstly, not all the midwives will have done that. And there might be a rule that if your midwife is not trained in water birth, that they're not allowed to care for you. So it's not like you're not allowed to give birth in water. It's this midwife is not allowed to care for you in our facility because she's not done the training yet. And so she might say to you, oh no, you can't give birth in water. I'm not trained to help to, And so something that a woman could say is, well, I am going to give birth in water. So can you please find me a midwife who is able to support me in that? And so we need to start walking into the facilities and saying, here's what I want. How are you going to give that to me? Because that's your job. We're taxpayers and we walk into public facilities who are supposed to serve our needs. We're autonomous people, autonomous women having babies. And so when we walk in and they say, well, you can't have a water birth, and the subtext might be because I haven't been through the training program, or our policy says that if you've got this list of risk factors, we're not allowed to let you in the pool. So just remember that those policies are written for the staff. Those are the rules that they have to follow. Those rules are not written for you as a woman. You don't have any rules. The facility creates rules for their staff members, and the staff members are required to enforce those, or at least recommend those as the standard in this hospital. But you as the woman don't have to accept that. And the law's on your side, actually, is if you say, no, I don't want to, then you don't have to. There's nothing, no one's going to come and say, well, you have to go home, or they can't withdraw care. That's not allowed. They are responsible for caring for you in the way you want to be cared for. So why wouldn't you be allowed? It's usually policy restrictions or facility restrictions. It's, they might recommend too, actually, your baby's heartbeat is very unusual. We would recommend not giving birth in the water. And there's certainly times at home where I would say to a woman, I think it's time to get out of the pool. But she doesn't have to take my recommendation. She could say, well, and actually that's happened. I've said to one client, I was like, I think you need to get out now. I'm not sure. I'm not entirely confident that the baby's well. She just looked at me and she said, no, I'm going to have the baby in here. And I thought, well, now it's just my job to keep her as safe as I possibly can. I've given her my recommendation. She chose not to accept it. That is entirely her choice. And now my job is to do my absolute best in this scenario. So yeah, there's not a lot of reason why not to give birth in water, except the hospital does have rules around it and restrictions.
So the response is, cool, sounds like a you problem. This is what I'm doing. Please get yourself ready. And then, cool, thank you for that information. I'm going to make a decision and I'm going to ask you again if I want you to intervene. And it's just like, no. This is actually an extension of my home. I'm here giving birth. It's your job to protect me and help me, but you don't get to tell me what to do. I love that. I just was smiling ear to ear as I heard you speaking about that. It's such a thing that women have just been taught underneath the patriarchal systems to completely people please. And of course, when you are in such a vulnerable state, you are in pain, you are in and out of consciousness as well. Like women are giving birth, they can't even really make eye contact with you. Like, it's really up to you having a midwife in the room and a doula and like people with you who can really advocate for you and say, they're telling you this, but remember, you don't have to get out of the pool. And it is their problem and they can work that out. I love that. And that really forces our systems to accommodate to women instead of women having to accommodate to the system. And that's where we're at the moment. Yeah.
And I remind people all the time that often you'll be restricted from what you can do in the hospital because they have a systematic limitation. They have a problem and they're asking you if you would please help them solve it. It's the same, I had a client who had her babies, a cesarean section, and they said, look, we don't have a staff member today that will be able to allow you to keep the babies with you and take them through to the recovery room. We're going to have to take them and you'll meet them again in the postnatal ward. And I said to her, do not solve their problem. She said, what do you mean? I said, they have a staffing problem right now and they're asking you to relinquish your babies in order to solve their staffing problem. I said, but if you refuse to let go of your babies, they have to provide a staff member. They have to solve their own problem. If you don't solve it, they are forced to solve their own problem. And she was like, oh. So yeah, I think we do want it. We kind of go, wow, you don't have any staff. Okay, yeah, sure. Take my babies. I will let go of the thing I've wanted the whole time is uninterrupted skin to skin in order to solve your systematic issue. But if we stop solving the hospital's problems, they become forced to solve their own problems. And so that's the same thing with water birthers. Oh no, I can't help you because I don't this, or there's this problem, or okay, that is exactly as you said, a you problem. I am getting in the pool. So now off you go, solve the problem so that I can have what I want because it's my birth.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's my birth and I'm going to do it how I want it. On a completely different note, I would like to talk about pleasure and physiology in birth. Can we talk about the clitoris's role in birth and expand on that concept? I had Juliet Allen on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and she spoke about in her second or her third home birth, she was putting lots of pressure on her clitoris, and she said the pain relief it gave me was phenomenal and I couldn't believe it. And she had some sexy times with her husband, and she said it helped a lot. And I was like, this is amazing. I'd love to talk to you more about that. Is there an element of what gets the baby and gets the baby out?
There is absolutely an element. So for those listening who are sort of like, oh my gosh, the clitoris, this tiny little P at the top, what would that have anything to do with birth? What you need to know is this supposed tiny little P is actually a huge internal organ that envelops almost your entire vagina. So behind your labia, the lips of your vulva, is the full anatomy of your clitoris. And it's huge. It's quite bulbous. It's a massive organ. We can't see it. The only part that we can see is the little head of the clitoris that sticks out at the top, which you can feel. But there's a shaft and there's a whole anatomy behind there. When you orgasm, we get this beautiful flood of oxytocin, which is the exact hormone that governs the contractions of labor and birth. Without oxytocin, you would not give birth physiologically. It wouldn't work. You would require a cesarean section because oxytocin governs birth so heavily that without it, it would cease to function. There would be no labor and birth. So oxytocin, what we know in an orgasmic state is obviously it gives us that incredible rush, but it's a hormone of bonding, love, friendship, connection. It binds people together. When you feel oxytocin collectively, it has a binding element. So then we look at it and go, well, why is it such a massive part of labor and birth? It's created in the brain, so it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and that's its physiology. When it leaves your brain into your bloodstream during labor and birth, there are oxytocin receptors on your uterus. And when the oxytocin connects with your uterus, it creates a contraction. And that's its function in the body. But it's still also operating on your brain and it crosses the placenta. So it's also impacting upon your baby and your baby's oxytocin system. So once you work through labor and the oxytocin is giving you contractions, and that's why we say, the thing that gets the baby in is the thing that gets the baby out. It's because of this oxytocin connection is during sex and intimacy, we're flooded with oxytocin. And the same thing happens in labor and birth because there's a relational element as well to these things. These are not just physical processes. There's a reason why oxytocin is flooding us at this times as relational human beings. And then actually the most amazing thing is that oxytocin peaks immediately after the birth of the baby is the highest oxytocin peak. And this is the time when not only do you need to give birth to your placenta to prevent you from bleeding after the birth, and this huge oxytocin surge creates this nice big uterine contraction which moves your placenta off the wall and out and then stops you from bleeding. It clamps down to stop the blood vessels from losing too much blood. That's a really nice helpful purpose for oxytocin. But you're about to meet your baby and your baby's about to meet you, and it's still attached to its cord. So not only are you flooded with this amazing amount of oxytocin, so too is your baby, and you're meeting each other in this oxytocin bubble. And so, of course, once you meet your baby in this scenario, you are forever bonded. Your baby is immediately connected to you because of this hormonal scenario, but also we're cognitive human beings. We know I need to love and look after this child, but we're hormonally wired to want to do that too. And so the purpose of oxytocin in that scenario is multifactorial, but the baby is feeling the bliss of oxytocin and the joy and the bonding and the happiness, all of those feelings, as well as the immediate bonding. And what we know actually is that oxytocin can operate like a pheromone. So other people in the space who are in that close zone are also feeling this. So you can imagine the change that could happen for a family if everybody's in there together, bathed in oxytocin, meeting this new baby. You would defend that baby to the death, partly because you are so imprinted by this oxytocin scenario. So I think we can't speak enough about the benefits of a physiological birth. Like, that is one small element of we are driven to care for our babies in more than a cognitive way. We're actually hormonally bonded and imprinted upon them, and that's how humans survive, is we actually are wired to want to care for them and to love them. And then the other people in the space who are involved in that process feel the same way about the baby. So there's this collective protection over each new family member. And it's just, I don't think we can, when you take out oxytocin, you impact physiological birth, but also humanity. And that's the issue I have with this systematic hospital birth process where everybody's expected to go to hospital, is it's not focused on oxytocin, on protecting oxytocin. It's almost anti-oxytocin, the whole scenario. Some women need to be there for medical reasons, and I would never speak against that. But I do have issue with going to a hospital when you don't need it, because they don't support physiology. It's not oxytocin centric. So yeah, what gets the baby in is obviously there is some similarities to what gets the baby in is what gets the baby out. And one of the key elements of that is oxytocin.
Wonderful. I could have listened to that rendition forever. That was so beautiful. Just how you were explaining how everyone is bathed in this oxytocin and how it is a community bonding experience, and how the people viewing that bonding are respectful of this bond that is happening. And there is almost a sacred and illumination of this moment, which is really beautiful. You also said something that kind of pricked my interest about how oxytocin has a lot to do with contractions. Does that relate to the fetal ejection reflex? And that kind of goes into the next part of the podcast, is this conversation that we're seeing a lot online. Do we push? Do we wait for that fetal ejection reflex? What actually governs each of these processes? I guess oxytocin is probably one of the many things that governs this. Should women push, or should we wait for that fetal ejection reflex?
Firstly, not every woman will get a fetal ejection reflex. And I've got a whole podcast episode called Pushing Out Your Baby. And then immediately following it is I think it's called Your Amazing Birth Reflexes. So in physiological birth, and we've got to remember, my expertise is physiological birth. I've been watching women's bodies function with relatively little intervention for 18 years at home. So I've got I've been able to witness a lot of physiology. This is not the case for a lot of midwives who have had their whole careers in hospital. As desperately as they would love to understand physiology, unfortunately, the system that they're in doesn't allow that to unfold, so they don't get to witness it very, very often. But in a physiological birth, there's a few things that fetal ejection reflex we'll talk about. Let's talk first about the Ferguson reflex. And these are two different things, and some people will use them interchangeably. So the Ferguson reflex is the same as the fetal ejection reflex, is what some people will say. Oh, that was that. They're two separate things. So the Ferguson reflex is typically the baby is moving lower and lower into the woman's pelvis as labor progresses. And then the pressure and the mechanism of the baby, so the physical pressure of the baby on the cervix and in the woman's pelvis, triggers this Ferguson reflex, which is, if you're witnessing it, the woman starts to make kind of grunting sounds, or she gets this little involuntary impulse to kind of bear down, almost like, it's a little bit like doing a poo, not a dissimilar kind of instinctual response to that feeling. And I've had clients who have started making these noises or involuntary bearing down to push out their babies, and they look at you like, what was that? And I just knowingly go, I think you're starting to get this physiological urge. What your body would normally do if nobody was here is it would start giving you hints. We're coming up to the time where your baby is going to be pushed out of your body. And so women, because of the position of the baby, will start to sort of go like, it's almost like I call it a bit of a reverse vomit, because if you go, if you need to vomit, you sort of, there's this involuntary contraction that happens, and then out comes everything. It's a very similar feeling when the Ferguson reflex takes over once your cervix is fully dilated, or the baby is down low in your pelvis. Sometimes your cervix is not fully dilated and you're getting the urge. It's a whole different thing. And so that's the Ferguson reflex. And what we know from some of the research, and Michel Odent, an obstetrician who's now since died, he died last year at 95, still writing research papers at 92 about the Ferguson reflex and the fetal ejection reflex. This Ferguson reflex is a lot more common. If you're in labor and you start to feel this involuntary urge to bear down or push, that's the Ferguson reflex doing its thing. It's like, okay, we're adding a little bit more maternal effort to the effort that the uterus is already putting into pushing out your baby. The fetal ejection reflex is a little bit less under your control. So what they know about the Ferguson reflex is that there is a maternal effort that's put in. Whether or not it's voluntary or whether or not it's inspired by the urge is up for debate. But women do tend to want to participate when they're feeling that Ferguson reflex. The fetal ejection reflex is like a freight train that has no brakes, and the woman is not participating. It's like the baby has ejected itself from her body without her input. Women describe not even pushing and their baby shooting out and leaving their body. That's the fetal ejection reflex, and it can be quite shocking to women because it can be fast and it can be unexpected and there's not really warning. So with the Ferguson reflex, there seems to be some early sensations, early bearing down sensations that build and build and build to then eventually the baby's born. Whereas the fetal ejection reflex is a different phenomena. And historically, people would say that the fetal ejection reflex takes over in a state of fear, in a state of high adrenaline. And historically, people have said that babies shoot out like that when women are frightened, and that their body would actually, instead of stopping labor, it would speed it up and shoot the baby out. But then Michel Odent challenged that, saying, well, actually, yes, I have seen it in those scenarios, in scenarios of fear where women are told, if you don't push your baby out, you'll have an episiotomy, or if you don't push your baby out, you're going for a cesarean section. And then midwives will tell you stories of, then the baby just shot out. But then Michel Odent talked about, well, hang on, I've been to physiological births where the same thing has happened. These were women who weren't in a state of fear. They were actually very relaxed. There was no interruption. There was nothing that precipitated it. And so he reframed the talk of the fetal ejection reflex as being actually something of peak physiological function that our bodies are all capable of doing in response to either just normal physiology or in response to fear, but it's the body's physiological response and ability to eject your baby out of your body without your input. But not everybody will feel that. It's considered a physiological ejection, though, not a pathological one. It's a sign of your body functioning efficiently. Even in that state of fear where you so that your babies come out because you think, oh my gosh, hell no, am I having an episiotomy or a cesarean section? This baby's coming out. It's like your body is just on your side and ready to function at its peak capacity. And I've certainly seen this at home as well. I remember being at a birth. She was a midwife, and actually her waters had broken that morning. And she said, oh, Mel, my waters are broken, but I've got to do a birthday party for her other child. We've got the birthday party on today. She said, so I'm not going to go into labor. I've got to do the party. I've got all the food. It was at another venue. And she said, I'll have the baby tonight. And I was like, look, okay, you let me know what you need. So she put a pad on and carried on with her day. And true to word, she went into labor that night and was laboring in the water, actually in the dark, which they often do because, that's what it feels safe and protected. And she was laboring. And then I just heard this little kind of sound. And then she just kind of was still resting there in the pool. And something in me, I said, did you just have your baby? And she goes, oh, yeah, I was just done with it. And I said, well, I think you should probably pick it up off the bottom of the pool. And she was like, can you get it? She just was kind of like, yeah. I was like, yeah, sure. So I'm in the dark trying to find this baby on the bottom of the pool. That was, wow, wait, where did it go? And so that was the fetal ejection reflex, but there was some conscious investment from her, but it certainly wasn't the Ferguson reflex because she hadn't been pushing prior to that. But I do feel as though, and I feel like the research is in its infancy because a lot of the research is done on animals, unfortunately, but then there's these observer, like Michelle O'Donnell, observing this reflex occur where we can kind of make connections between the animal experience and the human experience of the reflexes. Yeah, those are kind of, in a nutshell, those.
Fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. And you have a whole podcast on how you can push. So I'm going to direct everyone listening here just to that. I'll put that in the show notes. I just wanted to move on to hospital birth environments. We've touched on it a little bit. Hospitals are not conducive to oxytocin and birth. Like, I think naturally when any animal births, it's dark, it's warm, it's quiet. But hospitals, someone you don't know is coming in and forcing themselves to do a cervical check. So you're getting all of these different birth interventions and you're constrained, and I'm doing air quotation marks, by policy. What's your perspective on policies? What's your perspective on how women can walk into a hospital and go, okay, I was kind of wanting to have a home birth, but I'm here. Or maybe I've already had a home birth and I actually wanted to have a hospital birth, but how can I make this more comfortable? Can I turn off the lights? Can I put music on? What can women do to have more of a birth-supported physiological birth within an allopathic medical system?
So the reality is that most women don't have access to home birth or continuity of midwifery care. The system is not set up, even though the research is most definitely behind continuity of midwifery care, midwifery-led models of care, more home-like environments for birth, and there's a lot of great research for home birth. The maternity care system is not set up like that. And so that's why a lot of people will say the maternity care system is not woman-centered, it's system-centered. So what we need to know is that there's maternity care. So a midwife could provide you with care, there's all these beautiful healthcare providers who are capable of that. But then there's a system of care that when you become pregnant, you enter into this maternity care system. And I kind of describe it a little bit like a factory, a big machine with lots of different conveyor belts. And when you come in to the factory, into the maternity care system, you'll be allocated a conveyor belt based on the hospital-based risk analysis. So, okay, if you have risk factors, you go down this conveyor belt. If you don't have risk factors, you've got a few options. You could have the home birth program, the maternity care program, the midwifery care program. You could have a birth center birth if you want to. There's a range of conveyor belts, and they all operate in a systematic way according to a set of rules and regulations and processes. And for any factory style system, that's important because there's a lot of people, a lot of women coming in and out of that service, and there's a lot of care providers who are within that service, and there needs to be a system of care that everybody understands. There needs to be a set of rules. It's almost like a sports game. You all have to know the rules and abide by the rules if this game is going to work. If the factory's going to flow and everybody knows, what's going on, that's going to be the most efficient. So it's a system of care, but it's set up for efficiency, not for physiology. And it's set up to favor the maternity care system, not the woman. And even the very basics of physiology, we know that labor works way better at nighttime, for example. The input of melatonin, when you combine that with oxytocin, results in a much more efficient labor. It's why most women physiologically will go into labor at nighttime. That's when most of my work is done. I'm very rarely called out to a birth in the daytime. It's usually at nighttime, and there's a hormonal reason for that. But if you look at how hospital systems are set up, their busiest times are during the day when they schedule the most staff. The most senior staff are scheduled for the daytime. That's when they do their inductions. That's when, the lights are on, it's buzzing, it's busy. And then if you go into a hospital at nighttime, it's quiet, there's not many people around. It's on downtime. Whereas if the system was set up with the physiology of birth and the needs of women in mind, that whole thing would be switched over. Their busy times would be at nighttime, particularly in the birth unit, of course, not in the antenatal or postnatal potentially, but it would be the complete reverse. And so that's just one example. But the other thing is that we know that birth needs, quiet, people that you know and understand. It has to be supportive of oxytocin, and that means also not talking to women all the time in labor and birth. They do go into this different part of their brain that is disengaged from decision making and conversation. And every time you draw women out of that, you interrupt the labor process. Even the process of getting into your car and leaving your very comfortable, safe home is an interruption. And women always talk about, oh, yeah, my contractions slowed down, and then you have to wait for them to pick back up again when you go into hospital. So just that the whole way it's set up, they haven't thought about how is this going to nurture the needs of a laboring woman or a birthing woman. It's more just how are we going to get enough staff on the roster? How are we going to, it's all very focused around how can the system and the factory work as well as possible. And then women are put through it, forced to sort of comply with the rules that don't really meet their needs.
So what is the way around that? Can women go into that space and say, I want the lights off, I want this music, I only want these 3 people coming in and out. No, I am not having your cervical checks every 20 minutes. I don't need that. Like, what are some things that you can say that are absolutes? Like at least like 5 things women can do to kind of own that space, and so it feels more conducive to a physiological birth.
Yes. Yeah. So now we're going to make the best we can out of a out of a bad situation. Not that it's bad for everybody, but if you're thinking, gosh, I know this is not ideal, how can I make it as ideal as possible? Firstly, some decisions that you can make early in your pregnancy could really change your birth experience. If you know you're pregnant early on and you're familiar with some of the services in your area, the good ones, the midwifery-led services, the midwifery group practice services, the private midwives, birth centres, they book out fast. So you want to get in as soon as you possibly can. If you want a birth that is going to be more likely physiological, midwifery care is where it's at. If you choose something like a private hospital with a private obstetrician, you are putting yourself in the hardest scenario to get a physiological birth. We know from the research, if you look at it statistically, that for low-risk women, if they looked at low-risk women in a private hospital versus public hospital or with midwifery-led care, you're more likely to get intervention as a low-risk woman in a medical model of care. So immediately, if you're already thinking, I really want a normal physiological birth, I don't want a lot of interruptions, you need to prioritize a midwifery model of care where you preferably know one or a team of midwives. And if it's outside of a hospital, even better. If they have a home birth program or a birth center program, those are your best chances at a low intervention physiological birth. Failing that is when you are in labor and you phone ahead, tell them, ask things like, when we get there, we would like to get into the pool. Can you make sure that I have a room with a bath? Now, immediately you're sending some messages. Okay, this woman's planning a water birth. We need to select one of these midwives who's on staff, who has the skill in water birth. We also need to allocate her a room that has a birth pool in it. Immediately, you're kind of manufacturing your care team to recognize that I'm going to want some particular things. So please get me somebody who's got those skills. So a little bit of strategy there. The other thing you could do is stay at home as long as possible. The longer you stay at home, the less likely you are to get interventions. And we know that the sooner you arrive at hospital, the way that a hospital cares for you is to offer just micro interventions the whole way along. Sometimes these can escalate into larger interventions. So the less time you're there, the less you'll get. The more likely you are to have a birth without interventions. But that means having a really robust support team. And I think if you can do nothing else, if you prepare nothing else, it would be to first understand your own intentions and preferences for your birth, and then gather around you a team who's going to help those come to fruition. So you want to really let your partner know, or your support people, your friend if you're having a friend, or your mum there. These are my plans. Your job is to be 100% on my side so that you can help me get these things. I'm going to be vulnerable in labor. You are not in a position to fight and advocate for yourself in labor. You're going to task your support team with doing that. And they need to be prepared for that. They need to know that that's the job that you've given them. Hey, you're here to make these things happen to the best of our ability. So a robust support team, and that would include your partner, maybe a robust friend or relative, and I think if you're planning on giving birth in a hospital and you don't already know your midwife and you're going in there and it's that fragmented system where you just think, I don't know what's going to happen, who's going to be there, having some kind of continuity of carer with you, like a doula or a private midwife that you can bring with you to the hospital, is really beneficial, because then they can take on that advocacy role and you can prepare with them. You prepare with your team. Here's what we're going to do when we get there, and they're all there for you. And the one thing that really can sabotage a woman is when the people around her are just not on her side and they're not fighting for her or advocating for her. And she does not have that strength and capacity. I mean, some women do. Women are incredible, but she shouldn't have to have that strength and capacity that while she's laboring, to actually fight for what she wants and fight for bodily autonomy. The other thing you can do is just know about oxytocin. I think, how can I personally protect my own oxytocin bubble? So you've got this beautiful oxytocin bubble around you and prevent things from popping it. So any kind of overstimulus of light, people, sounds, all these things can interrupt the labor process. So it can look a bit weird, but if you put some headphones on with some soothing music and an eye mask for the journey to the hospital, it's kind of blocking out the very fact that you're in a car and that there's street lights around you and that there's other cars and there's other people. Try and go completely in the zone. And this is where your support team is going to shine, because they will take responsibility for your personal safety and make sure that you can get from the car into the birth room with very little interruption. They can speak on your behalf. They know the drill. You've coached them about what we're going to do when we get there. And hopefully you know your midwife. So when you get there, your midwife welcomes you in. They're a familiar person. And then it's about, you might say, well, yeah, I want to get in the bath. Okay, so somebody's turning that on. You just get in your own little world, go about your business. So it does take, in this day and age, preparation. Unfortunately, women do have to be informed and prepared, strategic and conscious about their birth planning. If you go with the flow, you've got to know that the flow is medical. If you enter that factory and go with the flow, they're going to pop you on a conveyor belt and you're going to get the care that they think you should have that is just systematic and uniform for everybody along that conveyor belt. If you want something different to that, you have to consciously work for it. It's not going to be handed to you. Nobody's there to say, hey, we'd like to tailor an individual birth plan for you. What would you like? So just knowing the fact that you have to consciously prepare for that in this day and age. And people say to me, Mel, that's not fair. You're putting their responsibility on women. It shouldn't be that way. I agree. It shouldn't be that way. But we have to be realistic. It is that way. And so if you want to sit there and say, look, I'm not going to do that because I shouldn't have to, you're going to get a birth that you're not prepared for.
What you're really describing is that cascade of intervention. I've come to the hospital is not conducive to birth, and that means that my birth slows down. And so then I am induced, and then there is Pitocin, and then there is an epidural, and then there is C-sections. And it's going, this is the system that you're going into, this is the reality. How are you going to stop yourself getting on that conveyor belt? And how can you still birth and stay in that realm and allow everyone else to take care of it? It's not really your problem, but you have to be aware of that problem and prepare for it preemptively, basically, is what you're describing. And I love that. Outsourcing. Sorry, hospital, that's your staffing problem. Sorry, husband, that's your problem. Actually, I'm busy. No longer 3D printing eyeballs. I'm getting it out. So can't help you with your issues right now. This is what I want. You go deal with it. I love that. And it is just, I feel like that is something that I think women in birth preparation is just something they really need to imbue, and selecting people in their team who are very happy to go against authority figures and say, no, it's not going to happen this way. This is what she wants. How can we work together to get it that way? Yeah. They have so many other things I want to talk to you about, but we're running out of time. There's one thing I really wanted to touch on was the rising C-section rate. So I have some statistics here. So in 2004, the rate of C-sections was 29. 2010, it's 32. In 2020, it went up to 37. And in 2023, it's 41%. And in the first 3 months of West Australia, so from January, February, and March, it was 47% of women in most hospitals in Perth had a C-section. So that's almost 50%. we are tearing our hair out. And then I've listened to your other podcast that spoke about the World Health Organization and how their data really strongly suggests that there is no benefit of C-section to decreasing mother or baby death beyond 10%. So we should only be seeing at a very max rate of C-section, which is 10 to 15%. Can we talk about this sharp rise in C-section from your perspective? What is driving this huge rise in C-section in women?
It is the medicalization of childbirth. It's the assumption that childbirth is a medical event and that it has these really strict boundaries. And this is something that happens when you enter the maternity care system. They go, these are our boundaries. If you and your body step outside those boundaries, we will consider you a medical problem, that you have a medical problem, and we will offer you a medical solution. The problem with those boundaries is that they are not realistic. They're not evidence-based. They are just culturally grounded. So even for things like the length of labor, for example, if your labor exceeds a particular length, or if your cervix doesn't perform in a particular linear fashion, you're deemed as having a pathological pregnancy and birth, and our solution to that is to cut the baby out. There are some genuine medical emergencies that require cesarean sections, and that's why the World Health Organization suggests that yes, 10 to 15% of women, for their benefit and for the benefit of their babies, need to have cesarean sections. And if we keep the cesarean section rate around that, we have this, that's the benefit of cesarean. We're experiencing the full benefit of cesarean sections. The minute the rate starts to go beyond that, we're giving what we call unnecessary cesarean sections, not medically indicated cesarean sections that are either being done too quickly because of very strict and rigorous boundaries around labor and birth, and that every event in labor and birth has been pathologized. Oh, this is happening? Oh no, that's abnormal. And whereas I'll look at it and go, no, that's not abnormal. That's normal as far as I'm concerned. My clientele, and I have a variety of risk factors represented within my caseload, approximately 90% will give birth at home, the people that plan to. We have about a 10% transfer rate, and they're not always emergency transfers. Some of them are precautionary, some of them are upon maternal request. There's very few where we would transfer for an emergency. And so I know that birth works most of the time when those rigid and unrealistic boundaries are not applied. But basically, we've pathologized a lot of the normal process of labor and birth. And as a society, we don't truly understand birth physiology. So then when we see something playing out in front of us that we don't understand, we assume something's going wrong, but actually maybe that's just normal physiological birth and you don't understand it. And so there's an increase in cesarean sections, but also the main reason for a cesarean section is having had a previous cesarean section. So now, as the cesarean section rate increases, the biggest number of women who are having cesarean sections are women who had a cesarean section prior. So actually, if we could start facilitating vaginal birth after cesarean section, we could reduce the cesarean section rate. But what's happening is a lot of women are having repeat cesarean sections because their first was a cesarean section and their care provider is either ill-equipped or not prepared to offer vaginal birth after cesarean section. So there's lots of reasons for it. Obviously, medical systemized birth has created this scenario where cesarean sections are easy. I do also believe that the profession of obstetrics is de-skilling in other unique skills such as breech birth, twin vaginal birth, manual rotation that they can do with their hands, skilled use of forceps, all these things that could facilitate vaginal birth. Instead of going for those unique obstetric skills, they're choosing to do cesarean sections instead. And so I think there's a collective de-skilling of the obstetric profession, and that's leading them to opt for cesarean section over some of the more clinical skills required for a complex vaginal birth.
Which is really disappointing because birth is a physiological normal process. It's happening right now. Actually, millions of women are giving birth right now as we speak. It happens every single day. It's not an abnormal thing, but there is just so much fear. And I think it's because now we are in the age of hospitals being more afraid of being sued than they are of traumatizing women. And I think they're very interested in protecting themselves. And they're like, okay, well, we are very assured of C-section, but we're not so assured of training our professionals and trusting our professionals, and also trusting women to be able to give birth physiologically as well. So thank you for speaking on that. And let's just finish on a fun note. I have some rapid fire questions. I want you to rate each of these from 0 to 10. So these are birth and post-birth interventions. And I just want you to say from 0 to 10. It's
5.
curb walking.
Ooh, 7.
Raspberry leaf tea.
3.
3. Okay. Perineal massage.
5.
Birth combs.
1.
Wow.
No, I know I don't say that out loud very often. 1.
Birthing balls. So big exercise balls that
Oh,
mums
yeah,
can sit and birth
10,
on.
10, 10,
Acupuncture.
10,
Placenta consumption.
1.
Evening primrose oil.
Ooh, 6.
Nipple stimulation during birth.
It's an 8 or a 9 if you need it. Yeah.
TENS units.
9.
Okay, and finally, having a fantastic midwife.
And give it a 10.
Yay! Thank you so much for your time. I'm glad you came on the pod. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to listen to this episode. If you loved it, please remember to like, subscribe, and send to a loved one. If you want to learn more from ARC Women, please check out the website at arcwoman.com.au, where you can find a plethora of offerings like charts, masterclasses, courses, and organic clothing. You can also head over to patreon.com/arcwoman or substack.com/arcwoman to join the community. I hope you have a really beautiful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world, and I will see you on the next episode.